Hello and welcome to this revision video for Paper 2, Health and People. This video is all about the first theme that we're learning about, which is understanding of disease and also how treatments have evolved over time. Now, your history teacher will have already given you a copy of the sheet that looks like this. There are 4 pages on this document. Obviously, that's just page 1 there. And this information on these slides goes with exactly what is in that copy. Now, as you're listening, you could be highlighting this sheet and maybe annotating it with any extra details that I say, or even just doing things like writing some keywords around the outside just to make sure that those really key points stand out. Now, this is an optional activity, but one that I think is really worthwhile, and that is to complete a red pen, black pen activity, or at least the first half of it, before you start actually watching this revision video. So what I would try and do is write down on a scrap piece of paper everything you can remember about what people thought caused disease in the medieval, Renaissance, 1800s and 1900s periods, but also how they treated disease. So how they tried to kind of prevent it and how they tried to treat people when they already had it as well. So again, for each of those 4 time periods would be a really good idea. So this will then help you identify what you actually know really well already and also what your weaker areas are. So then you can pay particularly close attention to those sections of the video as you're going through. So pause it here to have a go on that scrap piece of paper, writing down everything you can remember without looking at that information sheet. Another good idea for when you're actually watching this video is to make some notes about the understanding of disease over time and condensing it down onto one A3 sheet of paper. So you might want to divide it into 4 and have the 4 time periods written on it, and then make sure you're not writing down everything from this video in the information sheets, but you're really trying to be concise and trying to make sure that you're just filtering it down into the absolute key points for each of those time periods. We're now going to make a start talking through the information. Now, to begin with, we're going to think about what did they think caused illness in the medieval period. Now, generally, medieval knowledge was pretty shocking when it came to medicine, and medieval doctors, despite going to university, didn't really have a clue what actually caused disease. Now, they were basing their ideas on a man called Hippocrates, who was a Greek doctor that had been around in about the year 400 BC, so around about 1,000 years ago, when the medieval doctors were around. They were also basing their ideas on Galen, who had come a couple of hundred years after Hippocrates as well. And they were generally thinking about things like the 4 humours. So they believed that basically the body was made up of these 4 different humours: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm and blood. And they believed that you became ill when your humours were imbalanced. Now, that was an idea that basically slowed down medicine for quite a long time, because it meant that they used the main treatment of bleeding for a long time, which we'll come back to in a second. However, this was, remember, actually quite important, and Hippocrates is seen as the founder of modern medicine because he basically was the first person that really started to think about the body and natural causes rather than believing in religious causes of disease. So the problem was, because they didn't know what caused disease, they then didn't know how to deal with outbreaks of disease like the Black Death. Now, this is something that came to England in 1348. If you're watching this when you've only just started learning about health and the people, we won't have actually looked at the Black Death in any detail yet. That's going to come into theme 2. But essentially, this was an outbreak of disease that killed 75 million people worldwide. And one of the reasons why it killed so many people is because they had no understanding of the bacteria that caused it and how it was spread. So the doctors were therefore powerless to stop it killing over 1/3 of the population in Britain. Now, they didn't know what caused disease, but they blamed everything that they could, from things like the stars and planets being misaligned, to demons and witches, to things like sin, saying that illness was a punishment from God. But they also believed in things like bad smells causing disease, and that is known as the miasma theory. And that actually lasted until the 1860s, until they actually started believing in Pasteur's germ theory. Now, doctors would try and do things like consulting astrological charts and calendars to try and decide on how to treat a patient, because remember that they believe that things like the stars and the planets being misaligned had been what actually caused illness. But they did also have some quite sensible things as well, like urine charts. This would help them diagnose some illnesses by looking at the urine and occasionally tasting it as well. So remember, these are the key points that you need to know about how what people believed caused illness in the medieval period. If you've got your revision sheets with you, you might want to highlight those key points now, or if you're doing that A3 summary sheet of the 4 time periods, you might want to make a couple of notes about this first little section of the medieval period. We're now going to think about medieval treatments. Now, I've broken this down into 2 slides of information. This one's got generally what the treatments were, and on the next slide, we've got more about who actually treated the sick. So to start with, obviously we know that the main idea that they believed in the medieval period, left over from the Greek doctor Hippocrates, was they believed in the 4 humours causing illness and the idea of your body being out of balance. So as a response to that, Galen then developed this idea of the theory of opposites. And so basically they tried to treat you by trying to solve the imbalance in your 4 humours. So for instance, let's say that you were really hot and you had a fever. They would then try and make you cold by putting things like a cold flannel on your head. So there were some sensible things that they were doing. However, they also had some less sensible ideas as well. For instance, one of the main reasons that people believed they were ill was because they had too much blood, and therefore the most common medieval treatment was actually bloodletting, and this is where they would basically try and get rid of blood through using things like leeches or by making a small incision known as cupping. So this could be done in a few different ways, and people would often go to a barber surgeon for this treatment. They also tried to use purging as a treatment as well. This is basically something to make you ill out of one end or the other to get rid of things that they thought were harmful for your body. As we know already, doctors consulted things like astrological charts to try and work out what treatments they could use at various times of the month or year. And we can also see that they use lots of different cures, or so-called cures, during the Black Death. Remember, this is something that arrived in England in 1348, and they had no idea what caused it. So they used a wide variety of treatments, including doing things like whipping themselves. There was a group of people called the Flagellants that basically went through the streets whipping themselves in public to say they were sorry to God for their sins. So basically that kind of goes with this idea that they thought God caused illness, but they were also doing things as well like shaving chicken bums and rubbing live chickens on their buboes. So there was lots of different so-called treatments. They would try and do things as well like sniffing sweet-smelling herbs to try and stop themselves getting the disease if they believed that miasma was the cause. So lots of different treatments. I haven't put all of them on here, but you might remember from lessons as well, looking at some ridiculous cures that they believed in, like swallowing live frogs if you had asthma, and also doing some more sensible things as well, like putting garlic on eye infections, which isn't an ideal modern treatment, but there are antiseptic qualities to things like garlic. So there were some sensible things that they did and some less sensible as well. The next area that you need to know about for medieval treatments is a little bit more about who actually treated the sick and kind of where they were treated as well. Now, as well as doing things like bleeding, they also did have some herbal remedies, and these were generally sold by apothecaries or wise women. So the idea was that you would go to one of these people because basically physicians at this point were just too expensive for the ordinary population. So they would often go to an apothecary, and these apothecaries were actually trained through apprenticeships on the job, but there was also those wise women as well. And both of these sets of people would sometimes use what they called the herbal books, which would be recipes that were passed down from healer to healer. But at this point, there were actually very few of them that could read. So most people were relying more on knowledge that had been passed down verbally rather than actually being able to read about these different things. Now, there were some physicians in England as well, but in the year 1300, during the late medieval period, there were only 100 physicians in the whole of Britain. So these were, there were very few and far between of these people, and their medical knowledge was still incredibly limited. Now, they had trained at university for at least 7 years. While they were there, they read the ancient texts of Hippocrates and Galen, and therefore their knowledge was quite limited. Now, you don't know anything about hospitals yet if you're watching this at the end of studying theme 1, because it's something we're going to look at in theme 2 when we look at public health and hospitals. But just to be aware of at the moment, in terms of where these treatments took place, they didn't take place in hospitals like we'd have today. As we've mentioned, they would go to an apothecary or a wise woman to get their treatment. Generally, hospitals were around, and there were about 160 in the medieval period, but these were generally places of care where you would get a bed and food, and they were not really places of treatment, and that's because a lot of the time they believed that God had made them ill, so they didn't think it was right to try and treat people when you were in hospitals, and these hospitals were often run by the church. So pause the video here if you wanted to make any notes about medieval treatments. This is the final area to know about for medieval medicine and their understanding of disease. Now, generally in this period, Islamic medicine was miles ahead of European medicine, and that is because after the fall of the Roman Empire and after the Romans had left Britain in about the year 400, it then started what's sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages in Britain, and this is where basically people lost a lot of the advances in medical knowledge and things like public health after the Romans left, because there wasn't one central government in Britain. There was lots of different tribes and lots of different groups of people, and therefore their kind of knowledge was not retained from the Roman period. However, thanks to Islamic scholars, they actually kept the work of Hippocrates and Galen alive because they translated it into Arabic and therefore preserved that knowledge, which then eventually during the medieval period was then translated back into things like Latin so that it could be read again by those doctors in the universities in Britain, and thanks to some English monks who also then made more copies of those books as well, that knowledge was then passed back to the British population in various forms. So Islamic medicine generally miles ahead of European medicine, and even during things like the Crusades, even the British knights wanted to be treated by the Islamic doctors instead, because they were actually much more advanced than the European ones. There were also other individuals like A.V. Senna, who is a really important Islamic scholar to know about, who wrote something called the Canon of Medicine. Now, this book was an absolutely crucial book in the medieval period. It was essentially a medical encyclopedia which ended up listing the properties of 760 different drugs. And it was so popular that it ended up being used as the standard European medical textbook used to teach doctors in the West until the 1600s. And this basically combined the ideas of Hippocrates and Galen with the knowledge of the Islamic world. So generally in this period, Islamic medicine was further ahead, and that was generally because it was much more rational and evidence-based, and generally Muslim doctors at this point are much more skilled and knowledgeable than the British physicians. For instance, they even had to pass an examination where there was no regulations in England about who could be a doctor. We've now come to the end of the notes on medieval medicine, so if you haven't made any notes on that A3 sheet that I advised you to make as we're going through, it could be a good idea to just pause here and make some brief notes on it. So we're now going to move on to the next time period and think about what do they think caused illness in the Renaissance or early modern time period. And when we're thinking about this, we're generally thinking about the period from about 1450 to the late 1700s. Now, we've thought about in the medieval period how they believed in a wide range of things that made people ill. They believed in religious causes, they believed in miasma and bad smells, they believed in the four humours. And this still continued in the Renaissance period. All of those theories basically remained. And we can see that in the fact that they believed in a lot of these theories when it came to the 1348 Black Death, and they still believe these theories during the 1665 Great Plague, which was the next big outbreak of disease that happened in Britain. Now, there were some people who started to challenge some of the old ideas about the body and anatomy and what made you ill. They've been based on Galen since the Roman period and since about the year 100. For instance, there were two men that did this really well in this period, a man called Vesalius and a man called Harvey. Now, don't worry if you don't know who they are yet, because we're going to study them when we look at Unit 3 and when we study anatomy and surgery over time. But essentially, Vesalius was somebody that carried out his own dissections, and he found out lots of things about the human body and how it works. And there was also a man called Harvey who did lots of work on anatomy as well, and he actually discovered that the blood circulates and it's the heart that's responsible. Now, these two people were challenging these old ideas of Galen, and they were essentially challenging things like bloodletting and the fact that the four humours theory didn't really work. But at this point, most people and most doctors refused to believe that they were right and carried on believing in the ideas of Hippocrates and Galen. So there hadn't been very much progress in this period. Generally, religion and superstition were still really important. For instance, a lot of people believed that the Great Plague that broke out in 1665 was caused by God because he was angry that people were sinning. And there was also a lot of people that believed the king's touch could heal a skin disease known as the king's evil. And that was the idea that God had, put monarchs on the throne and therefore he'd given them some kind of special healing powers to be able to stop certain diseases. So generally in this period, all you need to understand is not very much progress. And if you ever have to write about what they thought caused illness in the Renaissance period, it's basically exactly the same as what you would have put for the medieval period too. The next area that you need to know about is the treatments that they used in the Renaissance period. So we're going to talk through and think about who was providing those treatments and what kind of treatments did they use as well. So generally, just like in the medieval period, doctors at this point, physicians, were still really expensive. So most people are using the same healers that they used before. For instance, apothecaries, who they would go to for their herbal remedies, barber surgeons as well, who they would go to for those minor medieval kind of surgeries, things like extracting teeth, setting broken bones, that kind of stuff. The group that was new, that wasn't used in the Renaissance period, is the quacks, and we'll talk more about them in a second. So these so-called healers would provide many of the same treatments as they did during the medieval period. So for instance, when we think about the Great Plague, and we're going to think about that more when we do Unit 2, so don't worry if you don't know lots of detail at this point. But during the Great Plague, many of the treatments that they used were actually the same as the Black Death. For instance, doing things like smelling sweet-smelling herbs, doing things like whipping themselves to say they were sorry to God. All that kind of stuff had continued since the medieval period. However, we also get this time period where we have lots of these people claiming that they know how to create all of these magical cures that are going to basically solve people's illnesses. So we're going to think now about the quacks and quackery as well. And this was particularly big in the late 1600s and 1700s. And these were people who had no medical knowledge, who hadn't been to university, who sold medicines knowing that they didn't do as what they said. So they often just travelled from town to town, moving on quite quickly because they didn't want to be caught by people that they'd sold medicines to in the past who might then say, look, I'm still really ill and your so-called cure that was really expensive has done nothing to help me. Now, most of the time when they made these medicines, they made so-called cures to purge people, basically to make them ill out of one end or the other. And they said that that was a symptom of them getting rid of those harmful, toxins and harmful things in your body that were making you ill. In those medicines, they were also often using all of these new ingredients that they had got from around the world. So during this time period of the Renaissance, it's seen as this time of exploration. For instance, we get, Christopher Columbus he wasn't the first person to discover America, but you know, him discovering the West Indies in 1492. You know, we have, for instance, even the British getting involved in creating an empire from the 1600s. So this was a time of exploration, and all of this exploration and contact with other countries and other areas of the world led to lots of new ingredients, and these were often seen as kind of super cures. So for instance, quite a lot of Renaissance cures involve rhubarb, which was a new ingredient from Asia, and they also used to do things like trying to smoke lots of tobacco from North America to try and keep the plague away as well. So lots of new ingredients that they put in, but generally medicine still being quite similar to what it was. For instance, there is still the most common treatment up until the 1700s of bloodletting, which have continued since the medieval period. And as we've mentioned, many of the treatments were still the same as during the Black Death. However, there were some changes, like for instance, the fact that there was a greater use of quarantining, but I'll talk to you more about that when we do public health in the next video. A final point to be aware of for Renaissance treatments is that generally this period really benefited not only from this time of exploration, but also from lots of new inventions as well. So for instance, Caxton invented the printing press, and this is one of the most incredible inventions ever made, because by being able to use the printing press, they're allowing information and ideas to be spread far more quickly than before, including what treatments were effective. They no longer needed some monks sitting there copying out books by hand. They could now publish this information to a greater variety of people, even though it was still quite limited who could read. It was amazing at spreading things like medical knowledge from the 1450s onwards. So that's what you need to know for Renaissance treatments. The final area to know, which is right at the end of this early modern period, just before the 1800s, is about the work of Jenner. Now, Jenner was working on the disease of smallpox that was really deadly and widespread, and we can see this by the statistic that it killed 35,000 people in Britain in the year 1796. Now, they had been suffering with smallpox for a long time. It had been a disease that had had various outbreaks since the early 1700s. And actually, they'd been using this so-called treatment of inoculation since 1721, when a lady called Lady Montagu brought this idea over from Turkey of basically taking the pus of a smallpox scab and rubbing it into a small cut to try and build up immunity. They had no idea about, you know, how it would work and building up immunity and all that kind of stuff, but they still knew that this occasionally worked for some people. However, for other people, inoculation just led to them catching this deadly smallpox and then dying of that disease. So they'd had some various methods of trying to get rid of smallpox before, but obviously this inoculation hadn't been very effective. Now, Jenner was an amazing doctor who made the hypothesis that if you caught cowpox, you wouldn't actually end up catching the deadly smallpox. So he noticed that milkmaids who caught this kind of minor form of cowpox, which wasn't deadly, never caught smallpox. And then he came up with the idea of a smallpox vaccination. And he decided to give people cowpox and then later on give them smallpox, and he could basically prove that they wouldn't catch this deadly form of disease because their body had basically created this immunity. Now, it's really important to understand for Jenner that he does not understand how it works or why it works, but he just knew that people that got cowpox didn't then catch smallpox. So there was lots of opposition at the time. People thought that if they had this cowpox vaccination, they might turn into a cow. And that's why we use the word vaccination, because vacca is actually Latin for cow. So some people believe they would turn into cows. Other people didn't like it because it was something that was so new, quite terrifying. And some people didn't like it because Jenner could not explain why it worked. However, as a result of the vaccination program in the 1850s, that we'll talk more about later, smallpox has actually been eradicated and is no longer a disease to worry about since the 1980s, which is pretty impressive and is all down to the original work of Jenner as well. You've now got to the end of the Renaissance and early modern period notes, so it would be a good idea to make some notes on your A3 paper if you're doing that, or if not, it might be worthwhile to just think about the similarities and differences between the medieval and Renaissance periods, and you can make a very quick table like this one here. So pause the video here if you would like to make those notes. We're now going to think about the 1800s and what they thought caused illness in this time period. Now, generally, the 1800s is seen as a time of the scientific revolution. Things like microscopes had advanced a lot of this period, which then allowed them to make some amazing discoveries, including germ theory. So by the end of the 1800s, there was generally a greater movement away from superstitious causes of illnesses and things like religion to start to think about scientific ones instead. However, they don't go away completely. For instance, there were still lots of religious explanations and some religious opposition to certain treatments. For instance, when a surgeon who we'll look at in Unit 3 called Simpson discovered chloroform in 1847, some people opposed it as they said that God would want women to feel the pain of childbirth. So some of these ideas still kind of remained, but generally there was massive progress made in this period where they started to understand what actually was causing illnesses. For instance, when we think about cholera, which was a disease that killed lots of people from 1831 when it first arrived in Britain, most people at first blamed things like miasma, but John Snow proved the link between that and contaminated water. So generally, what they thought caused illness in the 1800s changed significantly, with things like germ theory being created, and often that was down to things like improved technology, especially microscopes, that led to that improved understanding. We're now going to think in more detail about the really crucial discovery in 1861 by Louis Pasteur. Germ theory completely changes our understanding of disease, and this was an absolutely crucial event to understand. So first of all, we know that Louis Pasteur published germ theory in 1861 after he performed the flask experiment. If you can't remember what that was, go back to your notes and look at how he basically proves the existence of germs and how they come into contact with liquids through using the straight stem and the curved stem experiment. Now, when he first publishes this, basically most people ignore it, and people didn't really seem to understand the implications of this work. They didn't understand the implications for human diseases and the fact that this was going to revolutionise medicine. So many people didn't know at this point that there were germs that existed. A lot of people denied what Louis Pasteur was saying and didn't believe that something as small as a germ could make something as large as a human ill. They also didn't know that different types of germs existed, and at this point Louis Pasteur thinks that all bacteria and all microbes are basically the same. However, a German scientist called Robert Koch ended up building on Louis Pasteur's work and ended up being what we call the first microbe hunter. What he did is he proved that not all microbes were the same, and he actually linked specific diseases to the particular microbe that caused them. For instance, in 1882, he did some work on TB, tuberculosis, and this was an illness that was killing lots of people in Britain and the rest of Europe. And he managed to identify what bacteria it was that was causing TB. He even did things like staining the specific microbes purple and then photographing them and publishing them in his books. He didn't just identify the cause of things like TB, he also identified the bacteria that cause things like cholera as well. So he was a really crucial person that was taking germ theory and advancing it further. And he was doing that because he was a great scientist, but also because there was lots of rivalry between France and Germany. But Germany wasn't created as a nation. At first, it was lots of different states, and one of them was Prussia. So we're going to think about the Franco-Prussian rivalry now and how that then advanced germ theory even further. So Louis Pasteur, remember, is French, and Robert Koch, remember, is Prussian, German. So the French government were not happy that Robert had basically taken the work and developed it much further. So Louis Pasteur wanted to then advance his discovery even further, and he ended up doing lots of work on vaccines. Now that Robert Koch has proved what bacteria is causing certain diseases, they wanted to try and find some cures, because remember that the German scientist is identifying what causes it, he is not finding any cures. So Louis Pasteur set to work on trying to find a vaccine for something called chicken cholera that was causing lots of problems for farmers. And he ended up doing some work, and by chance, after leaving some cholera bacteria in a petri dish for a few weeks, when he came back and then injected that cholera bacteria into a chicken, it survived. And then he kept using different forms of cholera and that chicken kept surviving. So essentially he had managed to prove that weakening a form of the bacteria and then injecting it into something will then allow the body to build up its kind of immunity to that disease. So he then was making this crucial discovery that was building on Jenner's work, where he was discovering not just one vaccine, but generally understanding how vaccines work, which then led to him creating other vaccines for other diseases, like things like anthrax and also rabies. So that was really, really crucial, because now we've got treatments for some diseases, but we've also got lots of amazing prevention for diseases as well. People could now be given vaccines for certain things that could then stop them getting that disease in the future, because their body would be able to now build up that immunity. So as you can see, by the end of the 1800s, there was a much more scientific understanding of disease, and that actually led to Ehrlich's discovery of the first magic bullet called Salvarsan 606 in the 1900s. We'll talk more about that when we look at the next time period. In terms of the 1800s, treatments and prevention of disease. Now, we know that bloodletting had been the most popular cure in both the medieval and Renaissance periods, but by the time we get to the late 1700s, it's no longer used. And that's because the whole idea of the theory of the four humours is being disproved by people like Harvey in the 1600s, and eventually people stopped listening to Hippocrates and Galen, and therefore they don't need to use things like bloodletting. We now get a lot more focus on prevention of disease rather than just trying to cure disease in this period, and we can see that with the work on smallpox. Remember, obviously Jenner had made that discovery in 1796 that injecting people with cowpox stopped them getting or at least dying from the deadly disease of smallpox. And in the 1800s, the government took responsibility for this and ended up trying to stop people getting it, preventing it before it spread. For instance, they did things like in 1840 making the vaccination free to infants, and in 1853 they made it compulsory, although it wasn't strictly enforced at this time. They were also doing things like trying to prevent people getting cholera by doing things like building the London sewer system. We'll learn more about that in Unit 2. And in Unit 3, we'll also be looking at surgery, and we're going to see a man called Lister who ends up creating something called carbolic acid that was used to try and prevent people getting infected during surgery, which eventually led to aseptic surgery, basically germ-free surgery that we have today. So we've now got to the end of the 1800s medicine. If you haven't already, it would be a good idea to pause here and make a few notes on the 1800s and what they understood caused illness, and also how they had developed with things like treatments and prevention. So we're now going to move on to the fourth and final time period of the 1900s or the 20th century, and thinking about what do they think caused illness. Now, we know Louis Pasteur's germ theory from 1861 had revolutionised their understanding, and the work of scientists like Robert Koch from the 1880s had made a massive difference as well, with trying to find and identify what microbes, what bacteria were causing certain diseases. And this had completely changed people's understanding. And throughout the 1900s, there were lots of people who were trying to identify what bacteria, what microbes were causing new diseases that they were encountering. You know, for instance, things like AIDS and also things like Spanish flu as well. So they were now starting to have a much more scientific approach. They knew about certain methods thanks to people like Robert Koch, and they were able to then try and work on trying to identify all of these different illnesses and what caused it, and therefore what can prevent it. Now, they were really helped in this time period as well with things like the development of new technology. So we have loads of amazing equipment now, which is helping us to identify what causes illness. For instance, we have even more powerful microscopes that have been around since the Renaissance, but obviously have got better and better over time. We also have things like CAT scans and MRI scans, which allow us to see inside the body without having to cut people open. And these have helped us really understand what causes illness and able to try and work on treatments before people get really bad symptoms of illnesses as well. And amazingly, from 1953, Crick and Watson also discovered DNA, and this has had a massive impact on medicine and has helped us understand hereditary causes of illnesses that can be passed on from parents to their children. So 1900s, massive progress in what they thought caused illness, which was all based on germ theory. The next area we're going to think about is medical treatments, which I've broken down into two separate slides here. So to start off with, soon after doctors and scientists began to identify which bacteria cause which diseases, they started to look at how they could then prevent people from getting those diseases and curing those who already had them. So there is some amazing and dramatic advances made in the 1900s. Now, one of Robert Koch's students was somebody called Paul Ehrlich, and Ehrlich made an amazing discovery in 1910 of the first magic bullet, the first chemical compound that people could have that would only target specific bad bacteria in the body. In this case, he found something called Salvarsan 606, named because it was the 606th drug he had tried to try and treat this particular bacteria that caused an STD called syphilis. Now, that was just the first magic bullet. Other magic bullets were then found throughout the 1930s and onwards. Now, generally today, we have an enormous amount of treatments available as a result of the fact that we now understand much more about what causes disease. But it's not only the fact that we have scientists that are able to find certain cures, even things like people being able to find things like insulin, and people being able to create things like paracetamol. It's not just the discovery that's amazing, it's also the work of the pharmaceutical companies who have been able to mass produce these cures and these, drugs that we now use in modern times. These companies have grown throughout the 1900s. They are able to mass produce certain goods as well to make it really cheap. For instance, we can get things like paracetamol for less than 20p from a supermarket, thanks to these pharmaceutical companies. Now, there has been some problems with pharmaceutical companies over the years. For instance, we have things like the thalidomide scandal in 1962, where the industry wasn't very heavily regulated at that point, and there was inadequate testing on a sleeping pill that was prescribed to pregnant women, which led to thousands of children being born disabled as a result of issues with their limbs forming. So there are now much more strict rules that these companies have to follow. Now, pharmaceutical companies are often criticised for the fact that they make massive profits from their work, but they do carry out lots of research into new medicines and treatments and then mass produce them. And they've even been doing things like mass producing cancer drugs since the 1960s. So generally the 1900s, massive progress with the amount of treatments available, and also the cost of these treatments generally has decreased as well. So one of the drugs that many pharmaceutical companies produce is penicillin, and obviously this is absolutely one of the crucial treatments to know about for the 1900s, because this was the first antibiotic and it's estimated to have saved the lives of 200 million people since it was discovered in 1928. Now, the person that discovered the properties of penicillin was a man called Fleming, and he was trying to investigate why so many soldiers were dying of infection after the First World War. And he was looking at a particularly nasty strain of bacteria called Staphylococcus. And when he was looking at bacteria, he ended up discovering penicillin, which was a mold that basically stopped Staphylococcus bacteria and stopped it spreading. However, he didn't realise the enormity of what he had discovered. And although he wrote a paper on it, he never tested it on animals or humans. And therefore, he didn't realise the kind of medical properties of what he discovered. Florian Chain then picked up his work in the 1930s and went to the British and American governments with it during the Second World War, and it ended up being mass produced after the American government gave $80 million to the funding of penicillin. And it's estimated to have saved the lives of between 15 and 20% of the Allied soldiers. Now, obviously, since then, penicillin then got mass produced and became used not only for soldiers but also civilians, and as we mentioned, saved the lives of 200 million people. It's been so important and such a crucial part of medicine, but we now have some issues with the fact that we have some antibiotic resistant bacteria like MRSA, and that's because we have basically overused and misused things like antibiotics like penicillin. So there's also some people who don't want to necessarily just use drugs produced by these pharmaceutical companies, and there has been, particularly from the 1980s, a growth in alternative medicine. For instance, a lot more people start using things like acupuncture, which is basically putting little needles in you to try and relieve pressure on various parts of your body. And it's estimated that about 1 in 5 people have consulted some kind of alternative healers or used some kind of alternative medicine. The BMA, the British Medical Association, dismisses these cures as nonsense, but obviously some people believe that they help them. We have lots of different modern treatments, whether people are going to use drugs, whether they are going to use this alternative medicine and alternative therapies, or whether they are going to have things like surgery to try and treat various illnesses. So there are so many different forms of treatments available now. Obviously, we couldn't list them all on the slide, and they are also not only available, but also accessible to most people thanks to the creation of the NHS, which was created in 1948. We'll talk more about that when we do Unit 2. So that's what you need to know about for medical treatments. So you now got to the end of the notes, and if you haven't already, you might want to pause the video and make some notes about 1900s understanding of disease and also treatments. What I would also suggest you do is work again on the black pen, red pen, or red pen, black pen, whatever you want to call it, that activity that you might have started earlier. So the idea is, without looking at your notes again, in a second colour, you now write down everything that you know about what people thought caused disease and how they treated disease in those 4 different time periods. And hopefully now you can remember much more detail about these 4 time periods and their understanding. If you're still struggling on certain areas and you feel like you still can't add very much to your notes, then it's important that you do some kind of other revision activity to try and work on consolidating that information. It might be that you do things like revising using your flashcards from your short answer test, or it might be that you make a revision clock, which I'll talk about on this next slide. So here, this is something you absolutely don't have to do, but it is a wise activity to make a revision clock on this. And I've broken this down into 12 different sections so that you've got one for each section of your clock. So you can see the medieval period is then broken down into 3 different areas, and this goes with what's on the slides in this PowerPoint, and then the same for the other periods as well. So well done for watching this video. Hopefully you now feel a bit more confident on that topic. And if there are any areas you're still unsure of, either go back and watch those sections again, or try and talk to your history teacher and ask them to go through it with you in a different way.